The tracer came out of the tree line before anyone saw the muzzle flash. It caught the scout helicopter square in the tail rotor, and in less than 2 seconds, the small OH-6 was spinning down toward the canopy below. Inside the lead Cobra, 23-year-old Captain Rick Daly watched the aircraft he was supposed to be protecting disappear into the jungle in a wash of green and brown smoke. 4 months out of flight school, his first real fight, and it had already started with a helicopter going down. This was Troop C, 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry. The eyes and the guns of the 101st Airborne Division flying reconnaissance over the A Shau Valley. 15 miles from the Laotian border, buried under triple canopy jungle, the valley had been a North Vietnamese Army supply corridor for years. They had brought enough anti-aircraft firepower into those mountains to make sure it stayed that way. It was America's 195th birthday. Somewhere back home there were fireworks and flags. Here there were 4 helicopters, 2 Cobras, 1 Scout, 1 Huey, and the North Vietnamese Army already knew exactly where every one of them was flying. If you're new here, we tell the stories the history books compress into a single paragraph, built from declassified records and first-hand accounts. Subscribe, and you'll never miss the ones the textbooks left out. By the time this mission ended, 3 of those 4 aircraft would be down. What happened next over the A Shau Valley wasn't bad luck. It was a trap the enemy had been waiting weeks to spring, and Rick Daly was about to fly straight into the middle of it. Rick Daly grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the kind of dry, wide-open country that looks nothing like the valley he would eventually fly into. He was not a career soldier by upbringing. He was a young American who had gone through flight school on the standard wartime pipeline, months of training compressed into a fraction of the time a peacetime army would have allowed, and shipped out to Vietnam, still learning the aircraft he would fly into combat. By July of 1971, he had logged roughly 4 months in country. In the culture of an air cavalry troop, that made him one of the new guys. He flew front seat in the Cobra, the gunner's position, the junior slot, while a more experienced aircraft commander flew from the rear. The unit he'd landed in had a reputation. Troop C, 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry, was the air cavalry component of the 101st Airborne Division, tasked with a mission that sounded simple on paper and was anything but in practice. Screen the A Shau Valley. Find the enemy before he found you. The troop flew what the Army called a hunter-killer team. 1 OH-6 Loach scout helicopter flying low and slow to draw the enemy's attention, 2 AH-1 Cobra gunships circling above to kill whatever the scout found, and a UH-1H Huey standing off at a safe distance, ready to move in the moment someone went down. It was an efficient system. It was also, by design, built around exposing a small, fast helicopter to enemy fire on purpose every single flight. At the head of Troop C stood Major James T. Newman, a Georgia native with a limp he never bothered to hide, and a way of talking that instantly gave away his rural upbringing. He was not a polished officer. He did not carry himself like one, but the men who flew under him would have followed him into anything, because he had a habit of doing exactly what he told them he would do. Come and get them, no matter what it cost. That reputation had not been built on paperwork. It had been built one rescue at a time, over missions that rarely made it past a name and a date in an after-action report. By the summer of 1971, the war looked different than it had a few years earlier. American ground troops were leaving Vietnam in growing numbers under a policy the White House called Vietnamization, handing the fighting to the South Vietnamese Army while U.S. forces withdrew. The 101st Airborne was one of the last full-strength American divisions still in the country, and units like Troop C were increasingly one of the only American presences still operating over ground. The enemy had never fully surrendered. The A Shau Valley was exactly that kind of ground. American infantry had fought and bled for it since 1968, including the brutal contest for what soldiers called Hamburger Hill. But no operation had ever cleared it for good. The valley kept its purpose, a highway for North Vietnamese men and equipment moving south out of Laos, protected by anti-aircraft crews who had been doing this job long enough to be very good at it. Would you have wanted to fly reconnaissance over ground the enemy had defended successfully for years? Rick Daly didn't get asked. He got a mission board with his name on it. On the other side of that tree line, the North Vietnamese Army held every advantage terrain and time could offer. Their anti-aircraft gunners were not conscripts thrown into position the week before. Many had spent months, in some cases years, learning the altitudes American gunships preferred and the patterns scout pilots flew while searching for bunkers and trail networks under the canopy. Their heavy machine guns sat in mutually supporting arcs, placed so that any American aircraft that broke contact with one gun almost certainly flew straight into the field of fire of another. This was not improvised defense. It was a system built specifically to punish the kind of low, slow reconnaissance flying that hunter-killer teams like Troop C's had no choice but to fly. For the pilots of the 2nd Squadron, the arithmetic of that valley was simple and unforgiving. Every mission into the A Shau meant flying into airspace the enemy had already mapped, already ranged, already rehearsed against. Division headquarters needed the intelligence those flights produced. Troop movements, supply caches, truck parks hidden under the canopy. Because without eyes in that valley, the United States would have had almost no warning of what the NVA was moving toward the coast. That need did not disappear just because the war was winding down elsewhere. If anything, as more American ground units left the country, the burden of watching places like the A Shau fell more heavily on the air crews who remained. Daly did not know all of this in tactical detail on the morning of July 4th. He knew what every green pilot in that unit already understood. The A Shau had a body count, and it was not evenly distributed by rank or experience. New guys died there. Experienced guys died there. The valley did not appear to care which. What he also had that morning was Newman's standing promise running quietly behind every flight, that whatever happened up there, someone was coming to get you. It was the kind of promise that sounded easy to make from the ground. On the morning of July 4th, 1971, it was about to be tested in the worst way Troop C had faced yet. 4 aircraft lifted off that morning on what looked on the flight schedule like a routine screening mission. The kind Troop C flew constantly week after week, into ground the United States had never fully controlled. They turned west, toward a valley that had already swallowed American helicopters before that year was finished, and was about to prove it could do it again before most of Daly's countrymen back home had even finished their morning coffee. The flight out was quiet, in the way these flights were always quiet. 4 aircraft strung out in the hunter-killer formation Troop C had flown 100 times before. The AH-6 Scout ran low, close to the canopy, its pilot and observers scanning for anything that broke the pattern of jungle. A trail worn too smooth, a hooch roof under the leaves, the glint of a truck hood that had no business being there. Above and behind, the 2 Cobras held altitude, ready to roll in the instant the Scout keyed his radio. The Huey trailed further back still, out of the immediate danger zone, its 4-man crew watching the valley scroll past below. Daly sat in the front seat of the 2nd Cobra, running through the checklist of things a new pilot runs through without meaning to: fuel state, ammunition count, the position of the other aircraft relative to his own. It was, by every account after the fact, an ordinary morning. That was the trouble with the A Shau. Ordinary mornings had a way of turning into the worst day of someone's life without any warning at all. Below, the scout crew had already picked up something worth a closer look. A stretch of trail with fresh use, the kind of sign that usually meant supply traffic moving at night and hiding under cover by day. The loach dropped lower to confirm it, exactly as it was designed to do, exactly as it had done dozens of times before without incident. This time, the jungle had been waiting. The North Vietnamese gun crews below had watched American scout ships work this stretch of valley before. They knew the pattern, knew the altitude the loach would drop to, knew how long it typically loitered before pulling back up to relative safety. On July 4th, they let the scout get low enough, close enough, before a single gun opened up. Then a second, then a third, positioned exactly where the first 2 would drive a fleeing aircraft. If you're watching this and you've ever flown, or loved someone who did, you already know the sound that changed everything in that cockpit was not an alarm. It was silence, the half-second after the first rounds hit, before anyone had time to react. The scout pilot fought the aircraft as long as he had control of it, which, in a hit, loach was rarely more than a few seconds. The tail rotor was gone. Without it, the little helicopter had no way to counter the torque of its own main rotor, and it began to spin. A violent, uncontrolled rotation that gave the 2-man crew almost no chance to pick a landing spot. They went down into the canopy, out of sight of the rest of the flight. Somewhere below, a jungle so thick that the crash itself would have been nearly silent from above. For Daly and the rest of the team circling overhead, the scout's disappearance was the signal every hunter-killer crew trained for and dreaded in equal measure. A downed aircraft in the A Shau Valley did not mean a bad morning. It meant a rescue mission was now underway. In airspace the enemy had just proven they controlled, against gunners who had shown they knew exactly what they were doing. This channel exists because stories like this one rarely survive past a line in an after-action report. If you want more of them, told the way they actually happened, with the record straight, and the men treated with the respect they earned, this is where you'll find it. subscribe, and help keep days like July 4th, 1971 from disappearing the way that scout helicopter just did. The two Cobras immediately rolled in on the gun positions the crew could identify, hammering the tree line with rockets and 20mm cannon fire, buying time, buying space, buying anything that might keep the enemy from reaching the crash site before help arrived. It was, in the language every pilot in that unit understood without needing to say it out loud, the start of the worst part of the mission, the part where getting your own people out mattered more than anything the mission had originally been sent to find. Behind them, the Huey crew had already turned toward the smoke rising from the canopy. They had one job now, and it had nothing to do with reconnaissance. Get down there, get the crew out, get back into the air before the valley took a second aircraft in the same morning. Would you have taken that Huey down into a valley that had just proven it could kill a helicopter in seconds? The crew of that chase ship didn't hesitate long enough to ask themselves the question. That was the job. It had always been the job. The whole reason a fourth aircraft flew every hunter-killer mission in the first place, trailing behind the shooters, waiting for the day it would be needed for exactly this. Newman was still at the squadron's base, roughly 30 miles east, when the first radio call came through. A scout down. Location uncertain. Enemy contact heavy. It was the kind of transmission that arrived in fragments, urgent and incomplete, while the men on the ground scrambled to make sense of exactly how bad the morning had already become. They would not make it out clean. The Huey dropped toward the crash site low and fast, its crew chief and door gunner already scanning the tree line, weapons up, while the two Cobras kept pouring fire into the enemy positions to keep their heads down. Below, the scout pilot and his observer had survived the crash, battered but alive, and now hiding as close to the wreck as they dared, while North Vietnamese soldiers moved through the jungle toward the sound of the impact. The Huey crew found them fast. That part of the rescue went almost the way it was supposed to. The two-man scout crew broke from cover, ran for the hovering aircraft, and were pulled aboard within seconds. The kind of clean extraction that, on a different day, would have ended the story right there. This was not that day. As the Huey pulled up and away from the crash site, gaining altitude and airspeed, the same gun that had already claimed one aircraft that morning found a second target. Rounds tore into the Huey's airframe. The pilot, suddenly fighting an aircraft that was no longer flying the way it should, had one priority left: get it down somewhere that wasn't the middle of the jungle before the damage decided the outcome for him. He found it in the last place anyone expected to need it that morning, an abandoned American fire base, one of the countless positions the United States had built, held, and eventually walked away from as the war moved through its final phase. The Huey came down hard onto ground that had once been defended by American troops and was now simply empty terrain, a scar in the jungle with nothing left to protect the 6 men who had just landed on it in a damaged aircraft, deep inside enemy-held territory. 2 aircraft down, 6 Americans on the ground with no working helicopter, and an enemy force that knew with absolute certainty that more targets were still in the air above them. For Daly, circling in the second Cobra, the mission had stopped resembling anything on the original flight plan. There was no reconnaissance left to conduct. There was a valley full of American aircrew scattered across at least 2 crash sites, an enemy that had planned this ambush with real patience, and a lead Cobra ahead of him, still working the gun positions that had caused all of it. That Cobra took the 3rd hit. It happened fast enough that Daly, flying nearby, did not immediately register what he was seeing. A gunship that had been firing seconds earlier, now falling away from the fight. Control surfaces no longer answering the way they should. It went down out of Daly's line of sight, somewhere in the jungle several miles from where the first 2 aircraft had crashed, disappearing without anyone in the air able to confirm exactly where or how or whether the 2 men aboard had survived the impact. 3 helicopters down in a matter of minutes, 1 Cobra left in the sky, and inside it, a pilot 4 months out of flight school who was almost out of ammunition and running low on fuel. The only American aircraft still capable of flying, over a valley that had just proven it could kill anything that entered it. On the ground at the abandoned firebase, the Huey crew had no illusions about what came next. They were sitting inside a perimeter that no longer existed, on ground the United States had once controlled and had since given up, with an enemy force somewhere nearby that had just demonstrated exactly how well it knew this terrain. Whatever defense they could offer themselves would have to come from rifles and a working radio, nothing more. Somewhere in the jungle to the north, the 2nd downed Cobra crew faced something worse. No one in the air had seen where they went down. No one could confirm they were even alive. In a war where helicopters were supposed to mean rescue was always close, close had just become a matter of miles of unmapped jungle and a fading window of daylight. For Rick Daly, alone in the sky above a valley that had just swallowed 3 aircraft, the next decision was not complicated, even if it should have been terrifying. He had almost nothing left to fight with. He had a base 30 miles behind him, and he had teammates on the ground who did not have that option. Word of the ambush reached the squadron's base almost as fast as the crisis itself had unfolded. 4 aircraft out that morning, 3 down. 1 Cobra still flying, nearly out of ammunition, and at least 8 Americans scattered across a valley the North Vietnamese Army had just proven they owned from the ground up. Major James T. Newman did not wait for a fuller picture before he moved. He scrambled every crew he could reach, and then did something a squadron commander was not strictly required to do himself. He climbed into a helicopter and flew west, toward the exact stretch of jungle that had just taken 3 of his aircraft in a matter of minutes. But even Newman's response had a hierarchy to it, and the hierarchy was dictated by who could be found first. The Huey crew at the abandoned firebase had working radios and a fixed position. Other aircraft moved to extract them, and the 2 rescued scout crewmen without needing to search blind. The men from the 2nd downed Cobra were a different problem entirely. Nobody had confirmed their location. Nobody had confirmed they were alive. All anyone had to go on was a rough sense of where the aircraft had disappeared from view. Several miles from the other crash sites, in jungle thick enough to hide wreckage the size of a helicopter from aircraft flying directly overhead. What do you do when you don't know if the men you're looking for are even still breathing? You keep looking. That was the only answer Troop C had ever operated by, and on July 4th, 1971, it was the only answer on the table. Newman flew the search pattern low, slow, and exposed, the same profile that had already cost the squadron 3 aircraft that morning, flown now by the one man in the unit who had decided the risk was still worth taking. Below him, the 2 downed Cobra crewmen were doing the only thing they could, staying hidden, staying quiet, and hoping the enemy soldiers they could hear moving through the elephant grass nearby did not find them before an American aircraft did. It was a signal mirror that changed everything. A small, ordinary piece of survival gear that every aircrew carried and most never had to use. A flash of reflected sunlight, deliberately aimed, cutting through the green chaos of the jungle floor. Newman caught it. In a war defined by radios that failed and coordinates that were wrong as often as they were right, it came down to a piece of glass and a pilot low enough and paying close enough attention to see it. He would not get a second chance if he missed this one. The North Vietnamese soldiers converging on that crash site were close. Close enough that finding the downed crew and getting them out had become a race, with a finish line neither side could see clearly, but both sides understood was almost over. Newman brought his aircraft down toward the flash, into tall elephant grass that hid the 2 survivors as effectively as it hid the enemy soldiers hunting them. There was no time for the kind of careful, methodical extraction training manuals describe. There was a helicopter, 2 wounded and frightened men on the ground, and an enemy force closing the distance by the second. This is the moment the whole mission had been building toward, without anyone planning it that way. Not a strategy, not a maneuver, just one man deciding that the answer to how far do we go to get our people back was going to be measured in exactly how far it took, and not 1 inch less. The pickup happened in the compressed, adrenaline-collapsed time that survivors of moments like this one almost never describe accurately afterward, because there simply isn't a clean way to measure seconds that matter this much. 2 men who had spent the better part of the morning expecting the worst possible outcome were suddenly aboard an aircraft, lifting away from ground the enemy had very nearly reached in time to stop them. Below, the North Vietnamese gunners, who had planned and executed this ambush with real skill, had come within minutes, not hours, minutes, of adding 2 more names to a day that had already cost the United States 3 helicopters. They did not get the chance. Back at the abandoned fire base, the 6-man Huey crew and the 2 rescued scout crewmen were facing their own version of the same math. They were sitting inside a perimeter that no longer belonged to anyone, on ground that had reverted to jungle the moment the last American unit walked away from it, with no guarantee that the enemy soldiers who owned the surrounding valley did not already know exactly where they were. Every minute they waited for extraction was a minute the North Vietnamese army had to close the same distance Newman's crew had just raced against on the other side of the valley. The extraction, when it came, followed the same brutal logic as everything else that morning. Aircraft went in low, fast and exposed, because there was no other way to reach ground that hostile without simply refusing to try. And refusing to try was not a decision Troop C's culture allowed. One by one, the stranded Americans were pulled off ground they had never expected to be sitting on that morning, lifted back into the air above a valley that had already claimed 3 helicopters and was still, as far as anyone flying could tell, entirely capable of claiming a 4th. For Daly, still airborne in the one Cobra that had never gone down, the day had become less about combat and more about endurance. Watching fuel gauges he could not do anything about, counting rounds he no longer had, and staying in a fight he had almost nothing left to contribute to except his presence. Sometimes that was the job. Sometimes surviving long enough to keep flying over your own people was the only contribution left to make, and it mattered anyway. By the time every American who had gone down that morning was finally accounted for, pulled from a crash site, a fire base, or a patch of elephant grass the enemy had nearly reached first, the sun had barely moved in the sky. The whole disaster, from the first tracer to the last extraction, had unfolded in a window short enough that the men who lived it would spend years struggling to explain how much had happened inside it. What actually turned that morning from a catastrophe into a story worth telling decades later was not a weapon or a piece of technology. It was a decision made in the seconds after the first radio call came in, by a commander who chose to fly the search himself instead of directing it from a map at a desk. That decision mattered because of what it did to the arithmetic of the rescue. Every additional aircraft in the air over the A Shau Valley that morning was another set of eyes that might spot a signal mirror, another crew willing to fly the same exposed, low-altitude profile that had already cost 3 helicopters. Newman did not have better intelligence than anyone else searching that morning. He had the willingness to put himself inside the same risk he was asking of every crew already flying it. And in a unit built around the promise that nobody got left, that willingness was the thing that actually closed the gap between a rescue and a tragedy. There is a reason Rick Daly spent decades afterward trying to get Newman recognized for what happened that day. Not just this rescue, but a pattern of them across Newman's time commanding Troop C. Daly had flown that morning as one of the men Newman's decisions were meant to protect, and he understood, in a way that outranked any official commendation, exactly what it had taken for 2 badly shaken Cobra crewmen to end that day alive instead of missing. The tactical picture also shifted in the unit's favor once additional aircraft arrived. Artillery and additional gunships were brought to bear on the confirmed enemy positions, giving the North Vietnamese gun crews reason to keep their heads down rather than press their advantage further into the valley. It did not undo the morning's losses. It did stop the bleeding before it became worse, and in a battle already defined by how much had gone wrong in a matter of minutes, preventing a 4th or 5th loss counted as a victory, even if nobody involved would have called it that at the time. By early afternoon, every American who had gone down that morning was accounted for and out of the valley. 3 helicopters remained where they had crashed, one in triple canopy jungle near the original ambush site, one further north where the second Cobra had gone down, and the damaged Huey still sitting on the abandoned fire base where its crew had ridden it down under fire. Recovering the aircraft themselves would take separate missions. Flown once the immediate crisis had passed, and the valley's gun positions had been suppressed enough to make it survivable. For the men who flew it, July 4th, 1971, would not be remembered as a victory in any conventional sense. 3 aircraft lost, an ambush that had worked exactly as the enemy designed it to work for the first several minutes of that mission. But every American who went down that morning came home that same day, and in a unit whose entire culture was built around exactly that promise, the difference between a bad day and an unbearable one had come down to a handful of decisions made under fire by men who did not have the luxury of thinking them through slowly. Would the outcome have looked different under a less aggressive commander? It is impossible to know for certain, but the men of Troop C who lived through that era did not treat the question as hypothetical. They had watched Newman make the same kind of call before July 4th, and they would watch him make it again before his tour was over. What made him unusual was not raw courage. Plenty of pilots in that valley had that. It was his refusal to treat a search as over just because the odds of finding someone alive had gotten worse. That refusal came at a cost the paperwork rarely captured. Every additional sortie flown into contested airspace was another roll of the same dice that had already gone against the squadron 3 times that morning. Newman accepted that cost as simply part of the job description he had assigned himself, long before anyone above him had put it in writing. It was the kind of leadership that built loyalty measured in decades rather than months. The kind that led a pilot like Daly to spend years of his own life, long after his uniform came off, trying to get his old commander the recognition he believed he had earned. None of it changed what the enemy had accomplished that morning. The North Vietnamese army had planned and executed an ambush that worked precisely as intended for the first critical minutes. Using terrain and patience, the United States had no immediate answer for. What changed was everything that happened after those minutes, the part of the story that determined whether July 4th, 1971 would be remembered as a disaster with no survivors, or a disaster that, against difficult odds, did not become one. The cost of July 4th, 1971 was written first in aircraft. 3 helicopters destroyed in a matter of minutes, a number that on its own would have made the morning one of the worst single-mission losses Troop C suffered that year. But the number that actually mattered to the men who flew, it was never the aircraft. It was that every crewman who went down that morning came home alive. In a war that had already produced years of casualty reports out of that exact valley, that outcome was not something anyone in the unit took for granted. That did not mean the day left nothing behind. The 2 Cobra crewmen Newman pulled out of the elephant grass carried the memory of soldiers closing in on their position while they hid, unable to do anything but wait and hope a mirror flash had been seen. The Huey crew carried the memory of riding a damaged aircraft down onto ground that no longer belonged to anyone, uncertain whether the perimeter around them existed only in memory. The scout crew carried the memory of a tail rotor failing in the 2 or 3 seconds before anyone had time to process what was happening. None of that shows up in a unit history. All of it stayed with the men who lived it, long after they rotated home. For Rick Daly specifically, July 4th, 1971, became the day that defined the rest of his time in Vietnam and, in a real sense, the decades that followed it. He had entered that morning as one of the newest, least experienced pilots in the troop. He left it having watched his commander fly directly into the same danger that had already claimed 3 aircraft on the strength of nothing but a flash of light in tall grass and a refusal to consider the search finished. It was the kind of experience that reorders a young man's sense of what leadership actually requires, and Daly carried that reordered understanding with him for the rest of his life. The larger war around that single mission was, by the summer of 1971, a war the United States was actively disengaging from. American ground combat units were leaving the country. The strategy driving that withdrawal, placing the burden of fighting onto South Vietnamese forces while American troops came home, was already well underway, and morale among the Americans still in country reflected the strange, unresolved position they occupied. Still flying dangerous missions, still taking losses, in a war their own government had already begun the process of walking away from. Troop C's mission over the A Shau Valley did not stop because the war was winding down elsewhere. If anything, the valley remained exactly as contested and exactly as lethal as it had been years earlier, even as the broader American commitment shrank around it. That contradiction, full risk in a war of diminishing commitment, sat underneath every mission Troop C flew in 1971, whether anyone in the cockpit said it out loud or not. The 3 helicopters lost on July 4th were not lost to a war at its peak, fought with the full weight of American resources and attention. They were lost in a war already in its final phase, over ground the United States had fought for since 1968 and had never managed to hold for good. Would you have kept flying that mission, knowing the war itself was already being wound down around you? Nobody in Troop C got to answer that question honestly, because the mission board did not change just because Washington's priorities had. The valley still needed watching, the supply routes still needed tracking, and the men assigned to do that watching and tracking still had to fly. The same low, slow, exposed profiles their predecessors had flown years earlier against an enemy that had used the intervening time to get better at killing exactly that kind of aircraft. By the time the last of the wreckage from July 4th was recovered or written off, the day had already become the kind of story that got repeated inside the unit, not with embellishment, because the truth needed none, but with the particular respect reserved for the missions that came closest to becoming something far worse than they did. 3 helicopters gone, 8 or more men who very nearly did not come home, and a commander who had made the difference between those 2 outcomes by refusing to treat the search as finished before it actually was. There is a version of July 4th, 1971 that reads as a success story, every American accounted for, every crash site eventually recovered, a commander whose decisive action turned a disaster into a survivable one. That version is true. It is also incomplete because it leaves out the men who spent that particular Independence Day doing the thing survival demanded, staying still, staying quiet, and waiting to find out whether anyone was coming. The 2 Cobra crewmen hiding in the elephant grass did not know. in the minutes before Newman's aircraft appeared, that a rescue was already underway. They knew North Vietnamese soldiers were moving through the jungle nearby, close enough to hear. And they knew that everything depended on a decision being made by men they could not see or contact. That kind of waiting does not end when the helicopter finally arrives. Men who have lived through it carry a version of that stillness with them for the rest of their lives. A particular kind of quiet that shows up decades later in moments that have nothing to do with Vietnam at all. The Huey crew sitting inside an abandoned perimeter carried something similar. So did the scout crew, thrown out of the sky in seconds by a weapon they never saw coming. None of them died on July 4th, 1971. All of them left a piece of that morning behind, in a valley the United States never fully controlled, on a day their own country spent celebrating the independence it had won 200 years earlier, unaware that 8 of its soldiers were fighting simply to see the next morning. That is the part of this story that does not fit neatly into a victory or a tragedy. It sits in between, a day that could have produced a headline about American helicopter losses in Vietnam, and instead produced something quieter and harder to categorize. Men who came home changed by 4 minutes. They would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who had not been there. Rick Daly went home eventually, flew commercial and charter aircraft for decades afterward, and spent part of that time trying to make sure the man who saved 2 of his fellow pilots did not go unrecognized. He never fully succeeded. Newman received a Distinguished Flying Cross for the rescue. Real recognition, but not the medal Daly believed the moment had earned. Some debts, it turns out, do not get settled just because someone tried. What stays in the end is not the paperwork. It is the fact that on a July 4th, when the rest of the country was watching fireworks, a handful of American soldiers in a jungle valley near the Laotian border were fighting simply to see the next sunrise, and that some of them are only remembered today because one man refused to stop looking for them. They did not ask to be part of a story about American independence. They were simply doing the job the Army had given them, in a valley the Army had never managed to fully take from the enemy, on a day that happened, by coincidence and nothing more, to carry weight the rest of the country was celebrating without knowing what it cost a few thousand miles away. What you just watched happened. The names are real. The valley is real. And the men who fought there that morning were real Americans, sent to do a job in a war their own country had already begun walking away from. A lot of them came home to a country that had moved on without them, to fireworks that meant something different once you'd fought for your life on that exact date, and to a system that asked everything of them and never fully settled what it owed. That doesn't make what they did smaller. It makes it matter more. If any part of this felt personal, the description below has real resources, because the men who served this country deserve support long after the last shot was fired.